Hello, everyone. I am Jay Wolf, sitting in for NESS author and pulp scholar Tameas Bloom on this session of New Edge Sword and Sorcery Book Club on this, the Day of Might 2024. October 23rd is, of course, the holiday of our so-called sacred genre of sword and sorcery, as decreed by the Skull himself, Howard Andrew Jones, the founding editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull and the author of the Hennevar series of Sword and Sorcery Tales. What better day to, excuse me just a second, what better day to gather and discuss one of the inimitable progenitors of our beloved genre. Swords together, Jens. You may have listened to some of our previous NESS story chats before, and the NESS Book Club is similar, but we'll be discussing a classic sword and sorcery story, something noteworthy from the 20th century. Listeners are encouraged, of course, to have read in advance to participate in the chat. Tonight's tale is Lord Dunsany's The Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth. As is the New Edge Sword and Sorcery way, we hope these discussions will bring new perspectives into this sacred genre of Blood and Thunder. As I mentioned at the top, I'm Jay Wolf, and I'll be your host this evening. I'm the editor and of the forthcoming Beating Hearts and Battle Axes anthology for Breckenberry Books. And I moonlight as the author M. Daniel McDowell, author of the Old School Renaissance Song of the Scourge Lands, the first book of which, Bringer of the Scourge, was a semi-finalist in this year's self-publishing fantasy blog-off. Around the table with me this evening are 5 fine, lovely folks from the greater sword and sorcery space. I'm going to start with Brent Lambert.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Brent Lambert. I'm one of the founding members of Fire Magazine. I also am one of the contributing authors for Beating Hearts and Battle Axes. And I also had a sword and sorcery story come out recently, and my favorite anthology title ever, I Want That Twink Obliterated. So that came out over the summer. So, happy to be here.
June Orchid Parker.
Hello, I'm June Parker, aka Brett Sonia. I'm a contributor to NESS. You can find my first story, How Many Deaths Till Vengeance, in NESS number 2, and A Serpent from the Ash in the upcoming NESS number 4.
Excellent. AP Thayer.
Hi, everyone. I'm AP Thayer. I'm kind of all over the space in speculative fiction. But I do have a story upcoming in Shatter the Sun, which is a new Neon Hemlock Kickstarter that just launched. Go check it out. I'll drop a link later if I remember. If not, hit me up. Very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Steve Westerrock.
Hi, I am Steve. I similarly kind of write across the speculative fiction spectrum. So I have epic fantasy, The Wings of Astaroth. It's kind of a bit of a doorstopper. There's definitely some stylistic crossover with some of the sword and sorcery stuff, but it's kind of pretty firmly in the epic fantasy genre. And I'm also the author, and I'm going to hold it up because I'm just excited that I get to hold something up nowadays, but I'm also the author of the erstwhile Tyler Kyle, which is a queer horror comedy. So completely different from everything else. And I'm also a reviewer for Before We Go blog, and I'm a judge for the Sphinx novella competition, which is kind of a sister to Spiffbo. So yeah. And I'm an academic. Yeah.
And last but not least, Solana Saita.
I definitely feel least compared to all of you fellas. I'm a civilian. I just hang out in the NESS Discord. I had a piece published in Swords and Sorcery magazine a couple months ago, Love's Red Blossom, which I was pretty proud of. I've been featured in Fangoria magazine a couple times for my writings on Godzilla and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I co-host a podcast named Defend Your Trash Movie, and I'm very excited to be here. Ooh, I know June would react to that Godzilla shit.
It's true. It's very true. I mean, how can I not, right?
Absolutely. I feel like there's like a lot of Godzilla crossover in the sword and sorcery space.
For whatever reason, yeah, there's just a bunch of us, dozens of us even.
There are dozens of us. Alrighty. So I'm so glad to have all of you here. Honestly, it is a delight and a treasure. So the story, of course, being discussed tonight is Lord Dunsany's The Fortress Unvanquishable, Save for Sacnoth. Because I was sort of corralled into this a little bit last minute, I did have to do some very quick Wikipedia research. I have read the story before, and I read it again today. However, I wanted to kind of check my bases first and foremost. So the first publication of this story was in 1908, which is a very long time ago, in his collection, The Sword of Welleran and Other Stories. So just as a brief reminder of the sort of story beats for The Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth. In the village of Elithurian, the people are having terrible dreams which are attributed to the distant, unkillable wizard Gaznek. The hero Leothric vows to obtain the impossible sword Sacnoth from the body of the great crocodile dragon Theragavrug. The great metal beast must be starved in order to release the great sword and the dragon's eyes to sharpen it. He adventures into a great fortress with many of the sorts of adventure elements we now associate with classic sword and sorcery. I feel like we're going to cover most of those, so I don't want to get too deep here. But I feel like this story is absolutely sort of a blueprint for a lot of sword and sorcery that came later. And I feel like there are a lot of things that appear in this story that we would now consider sort of trite or tropey, but these are absolutely sort of like blueprints of the genre as we know it now. So I wanted to kind of go around, and I'm probably going to reverse order just to be kind of a jerk, because I know how it is to be unprepared, or just to feel like I'm calling on folks. But just sort of like, what were your initial reactions to the story? Lana, I know you actually had some really good ones, so I kind of want to call on you first anyway.
Oh, thank you. I was relatively new to Dunsany. I said that right. I had read King of Elfland's Daughter a couple years ago, which fucking rocks. And yeah, this one did not disappoint. It was just some very beautiful prose, very evocative, very imaginative, and something I had not quite expected. I thought it was funny as hell. I like every new bit of bullshit made me laugh. Like, oh, here's some fucking vampires, here's some fucking gargoyles, here's a bunch of Arab camel riders, and
just like really
like,
very like this fucking guy again kind of stuff.
Exactly. And I was kind of having a good time. I think what it most brought to mind was Moorcock at his most sort of speed huffing, when he was like angry young man, going through here's some wild drug shit that I'm throwing at you. But Dunsany was the or Edwardian, I want to say, equivalent of that, because I know he was a guy that like wrote with a quill and whatnot. Like he was like
Yes.
Mozart. Yeah, a real banger, I gotta say, on several fronts, because I don't want to hog the spotlight too much, because that ending kind of puts it into fantastic perspective. Like you're just kind of having fun. It's very silly. It's very over the top. Even though the prose is very pretty, and then he just kind of hits you with that ending, and it leaves you thinking about what you just read, and it made me go like, yeah, this is not just he's not just good. He is good. So, yeah, those were my initial thoughts on.
There's a reason Le Guin kind of regarded him as one of the masters.
Yeah, doesn't everyone basically like?
I should hope so.
Okay.
I should hope
Yeah,
so.
right.
I feel like he falls into that forgotten category like way too often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I get it, and I feel like I should read Gods of Pagana at the very least, because
I have a feeling it's in your wheelhouse.
thank you. It's like, that shit is very good. If you're like, I think it's in your wheelhouse, so that I think you speak highly. I think
You have a
highly of me.
style.
Thank you.
All right, Steve.
No, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm moving along.
I was
Sorry
going to
about
say, what do other people think?
Well, I think. I also read The King of Elfland's Daughter quite a while ago now, but I remember just being blown away by the prose and also by what I like two things fundamentally that I also found here, kind of like an elegiac quality to the writing, and I think like that sort of mournful element, kind of combined with like here a little bit of humor, and then again in The King of Elfland's Daughter, kind of a concern with otherness as a theme, which is something I'm really interested in, and I think sort of like interweaving that with that sort of mournful kind of quality, and I found that to be here during the passage, and I'm gonna read the name because like I'm not confident. But during the passage with Thera Gavarug, and we're allowed to give spoilers, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We're working with the assumption that if people haven't read it, they are being spoiled about it, and hopefully go to read it anyway.
Awesome. Really. Yeah. So during sort of his starvation, there's certainly like the one thing that really impressed me. Dunsany creates this sense of like pity and pathos for the monster without ever stating that outright. And these days, I feel like a much clumsier writer would just be like, "Oh yeah, and we should feel sorry," like it would be spelled out in a way. Whereas it's sort of like really subtle here. I found like it was the way that the prose was used, the word choice, like the diction, kind of causes you to feel that without him telling you to feel it in a really obvious way. So I was really impressed by that. And then the other thing that really stood out to me was like the spider, because I love spiders. I adore spiders. And the spider with the long hair, and then the hair is sort of like removed out of the face. And I just want to draw this character, but also just how much that character like evoked Shelob for me also. So yeah. So, or Shelob. People say Shelob, don't they? I always said Shelob as a kid. I don't know.
I don't know if there's a right or a wrong answer for that one. That's another one where it's like we're just gonna have to go with what the contemporary reader thinks it is.
Cool. So those were my thoughts, and then like interesting weirdness of it with like Satan coming into it as well. But like maybe that'll come up later. So I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna dig on that in one of the later questions.
Yeah.
AP, how about you?
Unlike Luana and Steve, this is my first experience with Lord Dunsany. So this was a very interesting journey for me. And, like I said, I write kind of like all over speculative fiction. So, Shelob for sure. And then there was other little things that I was picking out that were like outside the realm of sword and sorcery, but you can totally see the pedigree of all of this fantasy stuff. Like for me, my favorite, and this is totally just stab in the dark if this is even the case, but the musicians around Gaznak totally reminded me of Azathoth, and like, so I was like, is this where, I don't know, that was like super cool for me. But yeah, I really liked, this is, when I read stories that are written in like the early 20th century, late 19th century, this is the first one that felt like it was being told to me around a campfire. A lot of the other ones are kind of like more maybe like gothic or verbose or what, but like this was so simple but elegant and conversational, that I could feel that I was just like sitting at a campfire. This guy was telling me the story, and that ending kind of made sense to me, that it's like, oh, and by the way, like, maybe this never happened and people are exaggerating, and maybe this guy never existed. And it's like, yeah, that's what you would say about a story you're making up. Like, I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, I was really glad to get the opportunity to read this. I listened to it a couple times just because the audiobook narrator that I was listening to was like pretty dramatic with some of the stuff. It was just a fun listen. And then one of the final like favorite things for me was just like the casual mention of vampires twice. It was just like a complete throwaway. It's like, yeah, and then the vampires were disturbed. And I'm like, wait, what? So yeah, good stuff.
June?
Okay. So when I read this story, I was kind of like knee deep in reading Dunsany in general. This was around like 2015 or so. So I think in many ways, even I thought in many ways at that time that this was very characteristic of Dunsany's work. Like it, with the language, he has this sort of biblical portent, or just sort of this biblical feeling to it. And he's very immersed in this sense of myth and legend and so forth. I felt in the context of Dunsany's larger body of work, this story was maybe not that exceptional, although you go back to it now and you see where it kind of fits historically into, you know, the mode of sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy. And I think that does give me a little more appreciation of it. Even at the time, you know, I thought it had some striking imagery, it has some interesting things going on. Like, I guess for one example, like outside of, I guess, historical and urban fantasy, you don't really see Satan name dropped very much in fantasy today. So that was one thing that always stood out to me, is like, ooh, hell yeah, this is all satanic and stuff. It's so cool.
It has some cult elements for sure.
Yeah. So overall, like, even today, this is not necessarily one of my favorite Dunsany stories, but it definitely stands out. It's definitely worth reading both in and outside of Dunsany's larger body of work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it was like I found exciting about it for this particular conversation is really just like the way in which it prototypes a lot of like stuff that came later. And the last time I read it was probably at least as far back as when you last read it, June. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Like coming back to it now, it was like, oh, wow, yeah, that was something I that, like didn't even remember was there. Brent, how about you?
So, like AP, this is my first exposure to Dunsany. So this was new for me. When I was reading it, it felt like I was reading the Bible, and I don't mean that in a critical way. I mean that in like, I mean, there's a reason that text has survived for 2,000 plus years. Like it's grandiose, it's effective. It uses some very simple storytelling things to draw you in. So as I was reading it, I was like, kind of feel like my grandma just pulled the Bible off the counter and is like reading it before she's going to bed. And yeah, so that kind of intrigued me right away. And then as Satan kept being brought up and knowing some of the historical background, what I was thinking was, I'm like, is he having to mention Satan to fend off religious people who would be quick to call him that or say he's worshiping that for creating these various things? Because I mean, you see it today. People still draw conclusions about people who write fantasy and like fantasy and read it. So I was thinking that as I was reading it too. I was like, part of me was like, this guy is so imaginative because of what he's giving you and also how he's already anticipating probably some criticism and throwing things in there to deflect from it too. So
I think we might have cut just a sec there.
Oh, yeah, cut off a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Sorry.
It's all good. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting observation. Like, I definitely noticed that the both the biblical elements and the like AP mentioned, like the like specific auditory quality, and I feel like a lot of short storytelling in that era was still sort of styled for read aloud. Like the like we had, of course, a robust print history by that point in time, but I still think that like one of the things that makes you feel the like oldness of the story is absolutely like how lyric it is when you read it out loud. And that was one of those things that again sort of surprised me coming back to this story for this particular reading question. So I wanted to kind of point out, oh sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, Brent, I didn't even think that what you were saying about him writing it that way to fend off any critique. Like for me, it was just like, oh yeah, he's just Christian, you know, like that's his big bad guy.
Obviously, Satan's
Yeah,
the
he
real
was
bad guy.
Irish, so
I am traumatized by my southern upbringing, I guess. So I just see these things.
You see it everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
I will say too, just like I wish I knew more about Lord Dunsany's biography because that would help me parse it a bit better. But academically, like I've worked on Satan and stuff, and just in terms of kind of what was going on, sort of in the surrounding like literary environment and artistic environment at the time. You're coming off like the 19th century and the Romantics and all of that kind of stuff, and Satan is sort of like a subject to portray in fiction. Even including positively, was something that was starting to happen. So you're seeing a lot more of that in the culture. And obviously here, he's not being portrayed positively as a bad guy. So I think, like what Brent's saying is correct. And also, just the evocation of Satan in a work, though, was probably more acceptable than and less laden, in a sense, than it would have been previously. But I'm curious, too, about, like, things like, how much Lord Dunsany, because he was part of the upper crust, kind of like knew about figures like Aleister Crowley and people like that, who of course had sort of like brought all of those conversations to the fore again in a very negative way amongst the aristocracy. So I'd be really interested if anyone knows more about like Lord Dunsany's like interrelationships with that whole group of people and like those controversies. Or
yeah, and it's the right time period for that too, which is why it's extra curious. One of the things I wanted to ask, and as one of Timaeus's bullet points, is why should people with no attachment to sword and sorcery care about this particular story? I'm willing to take a hand on this one if anybody wants to go first. Brent, absolutely.
I mean, I would argue like if you should care about this story because it lays the groundwork for pretty much every big fantasy thing that you've consumed. If you're of any age within, I don't know, if you're under 40 years old, you know what Lord of the Rings is like that, and its effect on the cultural landscape. So if you're in the least bit curious about any of that, or I mean, hell, you could just draw out a big family tree of like stuff this story probably created and everything that came out of it. So I think that alone, it would just be impossible to try to dismiss the story.
So
I was reading that it's
an
the first intelligent weapon or something that was in literature.
Real quickly, Oliver pulled out a good quote from Dunsany. When I went to King's School, I was given a lot of the Bible to read. This turned my thoughts eastward. For years, no style seemed to me natural but that of the Bible. So I feel like that's a pretty common, like I feel like that's a good clarifier on the tone and style that he was coming from. And I feel like it's in the delivery. If you have any kind of background, I mean, I was raised by two I would say like conscientious objectors to religion. So I was given a lot of like leeway to do things, but I was also taken to Bible school because my parents were like, you do need to know this stuff. And I feel like that the like sermonly delivery definitely comes through in the way that the text is written here. Like he's a master of diction, and that diction is definitely like has that conviction to it, which I thought was fascinating. So with this story notably influencing many writers, past, present, and future, which of the tropes that it deploys do you think are probably like the most remarkable or hallmark of the genre? Anyone?
I guess I'll start.
Thank you.
So one thing that kind of stands out to me, well, admittedly, it's at the very end of the story, but by the end, like Lealfric has like lost all of his armor. He's bloody from head to toe, and he survives. He just straight up survives like all of this stuff that he's been put through. And if you think of like, the Conan the Barbarian stories, for example, and just how like improbably, endurable Conan is, this kind of, I see a link there anyway, just
oh, absolutely.
Just the invincible, strong hero who manages to prevail against impossible odds, including being ripped to shreds, pretty much.
Absolutely. I think honestly that's a very astute observation. Leothric is definitely a template of the type of superhero that we think of when we think of Conan.
I was June, that I was kind of thinking the inverse of that, because obviously Dunsany is the progenitor of a lot of modern day sword and sorcery and fantasy, but he must have had influence too, and what his influences must have harkened to like way back. And the thing I was thinking of was like he's doing a reverse Beowulf, because like Beowulf gets naked to kill Grendel. And when he sheds his armor and he relies on his faith in himself, I guess, or the gods, then he fucks Grendel up. But later when he is armored up and he's the king, and he gets fucked up by the dragon because he's relying on material wealth. He's undone by his hubris, and Leofric is doing the opposite. He's being stripped of his armor by the what the fuck's his name, Gaznak.
Yes.
And so I was, because obviously Dunsany did not have all these tropes that we have, or that even people like Robert E. Howard had. So I was like, hey, what's he taken from? And I feel like Beowulf, or the very classic heroes of like the talking sword, with the fucking what do you call it, the Ring Saga, the actual Nibelungs. So I was like, hey, is he kind of commenting or inverting Beowulf's hero's journey, or at least his fall into hubris, but going the other way? And then kind of that ending, guys. I want to talk about that ending.
Go for it.
Okay, I feel like the trope of like, ooh, I've vanquished the sorcerer, and he's just a weak old man now. It was all a glamour that he was putting on me. Like that's definitely a trope that we've seen a lot, in the classic Robert E. Howard stories. But Dunsany adds another layer to that. Yeah, some people say that there was actually a fever that ran across the village, and Leofric just went into the swamp and killed some old hermit. And I was like, okay. Like, Leofric was being bullshitted by the glamour of the sorcerer. But maybe we were being bullshitted even harder than that, And
Layers
then he
on
had
layers.
yet another layer. It's like, maybe the whole fucking thing didn't happen, And because I was already in that Beowulf mindset, and Beowulf was in fact literally a part of an oral tradition where people just kind of tacked shit on over the centuries. I was thinking, is he kind of critiquing the classic hero as a guy who, because like when we think of hero is a person that does good things, but like if you go to Beowulf and Gilgamesh and those motherfuckers, that they didn't necessarily do good things. They were strong guys who kind of
They happened to
dominated
do
the
things
world.
that were like beneficial to
the
villagers, as it were.
Right. And often they would be of noble birth, or would be revealed to be of noble birth, the chosen ones and whatnot. And I was like, is Dunsany maybe critiquing that idea? Because like in the second layer of bullshit, where it was just a fever going through the town and he killed some hermit in the swamp, was it like, everybody's sick, everybody has the fever, but the privileged rich kid with a sword, his fever fantasy actually results in someone dying. And so I was like, okay, like, are you actually critiquing these very classic stories, these tropes that we've been passing down for centuries, and then adding, and maybe it was bullshit, you know? I hope you had fun, but it was all bullshit. So yeah, that's what that ending put me to mind of, and
I have to say I kind of like wondered really similar things, because I actually like also read like the Song of Welleran, which is like the first book in the short story collection.
yeah,
And it similarly has this really critical kind of like approach to kind of like the concept of the hero and of the warrior specifically.
Right.
So I don't want to spoil that one, because like it's not the book club story, obviously.
Right.
But
Thank
like
you.
there's a similar theme that enters in there. But again, like you point out, I think like that critique is often baked into a lot of these heroic narratives anyway, right? So
Right.
you know, it's like simultaneously within the tradition and also critiquing the tradition, but critiquing the hero in the way that the tradition does. So I think there's lots of kind of layers that are happening there. And I like, obviously I guess, you know, unless somebody has his notes or something, you know, we can't know how intentional some of those elements were. Did they creep through because they're there in the tradition that he's kind of like drawing on, or like,
Right.
you know, but yeah, it was really fascinating.
I'm glad I wasn't alone. So it's like, am I ranting like a crazy person? But was I putting my own
Dunsany
layer of
reaches
bullshit
far
on
back
there?
enough into various traditions that, yeah, probably the comparisons to Beowulf and so are like completely valid. It just admittedly wasn't something that had crossed my mind. I was kind of thinking forward a little bit into the sword and sorcery tradition, like in the modern day, basically. So
Yeah, right.
I thought that was a really good observation, though. And I think that it's funny because the long conversation kind of works in both directions. And that's one of those things that's like, sometimes a story that was written a very, very long time ago still speaks to us today. And that's part of why we do this, is that these stories have such a long tail, and that there's such a body to them that we can bring forward into the future with us. And I just wanted to see really quickly, Brent, AP, did you guys have any observations in that same basket? Just in case, I don't want to leave anybody out, but I really appreciated the like depth that we dug into just now.
Well, the only one I kind of noticed was like the evil fortress castle. That's like such a typical thing, right? Like that's always carried through. Like, oh, we got to storm.
I loved the scale of it. I had forgotten how unreal this scale of the story was in that regard. Like the fortress just having sort of an unending, eternal quality to it, and just being so small in it was such an interesting thing.
Brent mentioned that like you could draw a whole like family tree with this one on top. I feel like we haven't mentioned that Gormenghast would definitely be one of the
right, unquestioningly.
And see, I was thinking, because I'm kind of bad with canon stuff sometimes, but there's this mansion in Vampire Hunter D, which is this anime, and like as I'm reading this, I'm like, this is as batshit as that movie was, and it in the best way though, and you kind of like the way he writes it is like you almost start just you're not even reading anymore. You're just being glided through the descriptions. Like you're just because it's just one. I mean, literally, just like Shane be damned, caution to the wind. He's just going for it. Like he's going to give you every Assyrian swords. We don't know where they came from. They're here. Vampires. They're here. Gargoyles. They're here. Like, oh, there's one more dragon too, and it's got a scorpion tail. Like there you go. Like so I love the imagination. Just like he just was like, I'm just going to keep giving it to you. I'm not stopping.
So that actually leads really well into my next question from Timaeus's list, and one that I was thinking about basically the whole time I was reading this, because I am a bit of a prose fiend. And so I wanted to kind of find out, so how does the specific prose in this particular piece of Dunsany's contribute to the mood and the atmosphere? I feel like we sort of touched on that earlier, but I would love to know if there was like a specific passage in like his vivid description, his surreal imagery that spoke to you guys. And again, wanted to draw attention to like just how funny a lot of the stuff was. It did very much have that like that humorous aspect to it.
So for me, at least, one of the funniest things, and I had to stop because I was laughing, was when he was going in the dining hall and they were passing the message back and forth. And then they finally get to the point where it's like, yeah, I got the sword. They all run off screaming. Like,
Two at a time.
Yeah, that one definitely stood out for me. I was like, okay, this is absurd, but I'm here for it.
Really visual kind of gag humor type stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's surprisingly visual, really, considering that it is all prose.
Yeah, with that visual gag thing, that's such a good word for it. Like in the fight, when he pulls off his own head to not have his head chopped off and puts it back on, I'm like, this is Looney Tunes shit. Like, what's going on?
It's basically a Hong Kong action film at that point, you know?
Yes. Oh my God. It was such a wonderful, like, yeah, the cartoony nature of some of the action is really just outstanding.
Yeah, or even just bonking a dragon on the nose. Like,
yes.
There was one passage when he is like smashing through the door of the castle, and he's describing how big and strong the door is. And whenever I write, when I write secondary world fiction, I try to like keep in mind that they would not have the same sort of frames of reference as us Earth people. You know, they would have different similes, different turns of phrase, and then I'm always kind of like, okay, so do I just do a fantasy spin on a real thing we say, like take it's the bee's knees, but it's the ganjok sneeze or something, and some bullshit like that. And it's always like you gotta find a balance between like different different ways of speaking and visualizing language for secondary worlds. And when Leothric is like banging through the door, Dunsany is like, yeah, and the door was as big as let me just pull this up on the wiki. It was mightier than the marble quarry Sacramona, from which of old men cut enormous slabs to build the Abbey of the Holy Tears. And then he goes like goes on for like, by the way, so this Abbey of the Holy Tears, blah 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 blah, and like a whole paragraph, and then he's like, and that's how fucking big that door was. And like, I would not dare do that, because like it's just a whole digression into like yeah, the door was as big as the marble quarry of Sacramona, which in this world is this thing, and blah 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 blah. I would
World
like
building.
no, that I wouldn't do that. Yeah, but he's like, no, fuck you, sit down. I'm gonna tell you what the marble quarry of Sacramona is. You're gonna listen to me, and I was like, yes, sir, yes, Lord Dunsany. I think that's very interesting. So I thought that was like a huge like writerly flex, and kind of very funny in a meta way. So
Yes.
that was a passage that stuck with me.
I want to go back to what Steve said about when the dragon crocodile died, because that was like out of left field, such a touching, reverent moment that it like slapped me in the face. Like the slow death knell slowing down. I was just like, Jesus Christ, where did this come from? We were just like hitting him on the nose, and now it's like, I feel bad for this thing. Like, what's going on here?
Well, I feel like that's a good deployment of prose, though. That's where like the diction is so tight that you're given the emotional beats without being told to have them. Like, you didn't have any moments where it's like, and then the dragon was very sad because he was 3 days starving or whatever. Like, you don't have it force fed to you, which is kind of interesting.
Well, and it also makes me think about the writer-reader relationship as it probably must have existed back then, where I think there probably was more trust in a writer doing those asides and doing those kind of flourishes, where as today, as a writer, if you do that, the readership is going to be like, no, where does this mean? Like, where does that come from? Like, why is that there? Like, and then they're going to hit you with an email with the 5 bullet point dissertation on like why you can't just have vampires show up out of nowhere without explaining it. So
it wasn't relatable.
Right. So I also think with,
yeah,
you probably had that freedom to do those kind of things where I don't necessarily think writers today could get away with that because of the writer-reader relationship is so different now.
I think we should try and get away with that stuff way more than we do.
I agree. No, I agree. If there's anything that this story made me think as a writer, it was like, you know what? You should just throw caution to the wind a little more and just be like, screw it. You're either along for the ride or you're not.
Trust them just a little bit more.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I do feel like that pendulum is swinging a little bit back that way in some ways. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of it too is like because like he's committed so wholeheartedly to what he's doing, right? Like in terms of the style, in terms of his influences, like that biblical piece that you guys all mentioned, like it really runs through the whole thing. And like I went and I just glanced at like the opening again. And it reads like Genesis. Like the way he sets the scene is the way that the scene is set in Genesis. Like it has the same cadence, like of scene setting, and even like the aside and everything. Like it very much feels like it's drawing on biblical stuff, and it's also drawing on kind of like folkloric traditions where you would have an aside to explain the history of such and such. And especially when you think about these stories being told orally and that kind of thing, right? Like, so the boldness of it, which perhaps was not, necessarily bold in the same way at the time, but what sort of is received by us as that, at the very least, is how much it allows itself to kind of be itself. It's not, stopping to try to do anything else in a way. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that super well, but
no, I follow what you mean.
No, absolutely, yeah.
June, I noticed you had your mic on, and I couldn't quite hear what you had to say. I wanted to grab you.
Well, I didn't really say anything at the time anyway. I'm just raising my hand in favor of long digressions of world building and that sort of thing. Because if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best.
Honestly, I'm here for it. You have the best world building, so I really appreciate it, frankly.
Well, and I appreciate in the story just like how he doesn't necessarily take the time to explain everything. It's like, I feel like I don't want to go on a diatribe about like modern fantasy with some of it, but like I feel like that there's so much sometimes where it's like you have to hold someone's hand through the whole process. And with this story, it's like, nope, vampires, scimitars, camels. I'm not explaining anything. You're gonna ride with it, and
you have bought the ticket. You are taking the ride.
Yeah, you're either gonna follow the ride all the way through, or you're gonna get off. Like, but either way, I'm still going. So, yeah, I think that was, for me at least, like that was one of the lessons. Like I took from it. I was like, you know what, we need more of this. Like we need to inject more of this back into how we tell our stories.
We need more Wong Bongarok.
Yeah. Oh my god.
What the heck?
My favorite rock genre, Wong Bongarok.
I feel like that's a tribute band name or something. Like you get the
Either that or like the worst like wonton place in the city. Like I feel like that would just be the place you go and your stomach's gonna be messed up later.
Mm-mm.
I did get the vague impression that name and some of the other names throughout were very much a result of kind of like the growing Western fascination with the East and a kind of like Orientalist, like,
without a lot, without the benefit of Wikipedia, it's a tough world there. So we've kind of dug into like how this story relates a little bit to like kind of forward and back in terms of style and stuff. But as we're pushing, or at least we were speaking of pushing sword and sorcery to newer heights, what aside from the first discussion that we've added here, which is basically just that we all need to be a little bit more balls out with the world building. What other things do we think we can glean from a story like the Fortress Unvanquishable? Oh, I can't get it. The Fortress Unvanquishable, Save for Sacnoth. I'm going to call on you if you don't.
Maybe just working a little bit off what Brent said just now, like that idea of like you're able to, you don't have to explain every little piece. I think the other thing that fascinates me is just sort of like looking at the elements in the story that perhaps are part of like a series of symbols and connections that maybe we don't inherently know now, but that readers or listeners, audiences generally would have known at the time. So like recognizing kind of like the symbolic language associated with Gothic, for example, which is very rich there, or like other kinds of texts that have to do with like hell. So like the idea of the minstrels and the trumpets came up. That's like a symbolism you find going back through Bosch and like the medieval period depictions of hell and sort of like demons as sort of like blowing trumpets, sometimes out of their asses and things like that. Or like the idea of sort of like different levels or layers to hell, because the structure is called hell in the story, that has like, each one has a different boss, what we would think of as a boss monster, but like, like they keep coming and coming. But, those kinds of things too, we find in sort of like, medieval depictions of hell and some Jewish mythology as well, to do with sort of otherworldly journeys more broadly. So I'm really interested. All this is to say, this does have a point. It's going somewhere. But just like a lot of the genres that we work in across speculative media have that kind of legacy of a symbolic language that is shared and that we're responding to again and again. But we all kind of, the more distant we get from whatever the like original source, not that there always is one, but we start to kind of like lose pieces of that or lose sight of it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a natural thing, I think. Or it gets changed in different ways. And I think like, I don't know, I have seen also like a little bit of that fall by the wayside lately. And, or that sense of a kind of like symbolic legacy, I guess, or richness that maybe, like we want to draw on. I don't know. Do you guys agree that maybe that's disappeared, or is it not? I don't know.
Well, I guess like as someone who's like not as great with like being super well versed in canons of genre and whatnot, it's more so like I just pick and cherry pick as I go through it. But I think one of the biggest things for me after reading this and like just seeing the pure imagination in it and the way that it doesn't like, necessarily have some of these same trappings of modern fantasy where, you have to explain certain things to people. If anything, what I would try to project this lesson maybe to readers out there is, if you enjoyed this story and you enjoyed the way it did it, then ask yourself, why does a story from a marginalized person need the explanations? Or why does a story from, because there's certain people who get to tell these kinds of stories in these kind of ways still, and there's some of us who we have to explain everything just to get in the door. So so that was kind of like my takeaway from it. I was like, God, I wish I could just do this and like do it and not have to worry about someone criticizing me for these characters are too black. I can't relate, So so I think that was that. I hope no one's that blatant. That was so just kind of piggybacking off of what Steve was saying is like, I think that is the legacy maybe we should think about is we see what happens when writers don't feel like they have these constraints on them, especially in terms of like commerciality and business and whatnot, when they can just create the story, and we see like how evocative and intelligent and like really, I mean, this is a really dense story in the best way. And yeah, so that would be the lesson I think I would maybe hope people would take from it. Is like, hey, let's approach your modern reading with the same grace and lens that you're giving this story.
Yeah, kind of just going off what you were saying, Brett. You put into words something that I've kind of been like wrestling with a little bit, while I was reading it, and like the time since is the like this like risk taking or just like writing intelligently without having to over explain anything. And there's so many elements of the story that just like don't exist and wouldn't exist in modern stories, like would not get past any kind of gatekeepers. And the one that kept like sticking out of my mind is Sacnoth itself. Like, it's in the title. Like, why would the castle have its own enemy and its own, like, on a plaque on it? And then, like, 3 out of the 4 battles he has in the castle, and just because he's like, yo, I've got this sword, and everyone just runs away. Like, it's not like action or anything like that. Like, if you try, like, I feel like if you try to do that this day, you'd have to be like super absurdist about it. You have to go like full Terry Pratchett or something. And like, there's just like no like subtlety to that. There's no like breadth to that. It's just like, okay, I'm writing like clown fantasy.
I think that is. I was actually thinking about not just the title, but the plaque on the castle. It's unvanquishable, save for Sacnoth, and I think that's kind of Dunsany doing a little meta, like, because the title is the plaque on the story for the reader, just like the plaque is the the big sign that Leofrith sees when he sees the castle. When we enter the castle, aka the story, we kind of know, like, oh, okay, this is the premise. There's a fortress which is apparently very strong, but apparently something can fuck it up. It's Sacnoth, okay. And I almost feel that he's taken the piss on like the heroic narrative. Like, it's, yeah, sure, it's the evil Dark Lord's fortress, but he's the hero, so he's gonna fuck him up with his magic sword. And we all know this. We know that this is what's gonna happen. And but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we know that's gonna happen. And that the feeling I got, at least, he just puts that straight up front, meaning like, yeah. Here's exactly how he's going to do it, but I am going to guide you through it, and we're gonna enjoy it. You're gonna enjoy it. You're gonna listen to me guide you through it, and it's not what it does. It's not what he does. It's not about, ooh, will he vanquish the fortress? No, it's vanquishable because he has Sacnoth. It's about me telling the story, which I will tell you at the end is bullshit. It doesn't matter. It's what Steve said. It's the symbolism. It's the I want you to feel like you're part of this tradition. You're listening to me. And to harken back to what Brent said, we should trust the process. We should, here's a bunch of bullshit that I'm not entirely going to explain, but my storyteller's magic, Dunsany says, is going to transport you, and that's what's important. These are all just ritual elements, and what I think we can take away from this is the idea that we are all engaging in this communal ritual in storytelling, and what we call tropes are just the elements of the spell that we're casting, the magic that we're weaving. And people can complain about, oh, this character was actually overpowered, or what the fuck ever, or like this contradicts that, or you didn't establish that well enough. Sure, but maybe that's not what I was going for. Maybe I'm not, maybe this isn't a D&D game. This is, I am conjuring up a space that I hope you will partake in. I hope that you'll open your heart and your mind to something new. And I think it's very sad that, there is so many gatekeepers that want to limit the variety of spells that I feel like a crazy person. We're casting spells.
It's okay.
But yeah, so I think that's what we should take away from this. This is a communal activity, and it is magic, or if you will, a bunch of bullshit that makes us feel good or transports us. And that's what fiction, and especially fantasy fiction, is about. And we would do well to remember that.
Before I move on to the sort of closing notes and any audience questions, June, did you want to add anything for that one?
Not particularly. I guess one thing I was going to touch on maybe just quickly is it was briefly mentioned that this story kind of has a sort of fascination with the East, and you can kind of see those elements from just about the beginning to the end.
Absolutely.
One funny thing is that the word East is not actually used in the story.
Right.
So, because Leothic travels north to fight the dragon crocodile, he goes back south to Fort Sacnoth, and then he heads west to the fortress. But despite despite the story kind of being immersed in this, you could call it East versus West kind of narrative, or at least those kinds of tropes, the word East is not there. That said, you can start to put things together pretty readily, to a lesser extent, maybe the metal crocodile, but you also have the elephant in the hall. You have, what is it?
The Assyrians.
Yeah, the camel riders with their Assyrian scimitars and that sort of thing. And there's this particular level of coding, I think, that's going on here anyway. And I'm not the most qualified person to speak to that, but it was something that kind of occurred to me as I was reading the story. And that is something you kind of see in later SNS as well. They had talked about the Tower of the Elephant in one of the previous book club episodes, and how Yagkosha is maybe coded after Ganesha, potentially. So that's the sort of thing that you're going to see a little bit going forward from this story into other early modern SNS. So
excellent. I think that's a really good point. One of the things too, as we were talking about the title, it occurred to me that a modern editor would never let you get away with this title at all. It would just not happen. You would be told to put something else on it, which is sort of fascinating to me. I do want to say we are almost out of time, but I wanted to go around really quickly and see if anybody had last thoughts, other things that came to mind. And while we were talking, I feel like we covered a lot of bases considering the overall length of this actual story. And I'm so glad to have had a conversation with all of you. You are all so insightful and have such a wide range of experience that it allows us to have conversations that are just absolutely delightful. And I wanted to, I guess, if there are any questions in the audience, we can get them very quickly. I can quickly address them, but if not, I don't want to hold anybody here over long either. You've all donated a wonderful amount of your day to us, and we are sincerely appreciative of that. So, alrighty, last thoughts.
I just want to say how this is my first time being on here, and I really enjoyed this conversation. You guys are really awesome. Yeah.
Me too. Likewise to all of you.
Yeah, no.
And thank you for having us, Jay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this whole thing was great. Any excuse to read new stuff that I've never heard of and meet new people and talk about it and learn from much smarter people is great.
Alrighty. So I am probably going to wrap this up here unless something emerges very Again, I feel like we covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, and
Yeah.
I am just absolutely delighted. So I wanted to thank each of you, Brent Lambert, June Orchid Parker, Luna Saida, Steve Westenra, AP Thayer. You guys are all absolutely fantastic for being here. Some of you very, very late or very, very early. So I sincerely appreciate that. And thank you all for being here to listen to us gab for an hour. I feel like that's really wonderful. Everybody in the audience, I sincerely appreciate your presence here. It makes these things fun to do. In the meantime, you can follow NESS on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and for now on Twitter. If you want to know when the next book club is and what story we'll be covering. In the meantime, I have been Jay Wolf, and happy to host for just one time. All right.
You did a great job, Jay.
Thank you.